Good morning, and welcome to another reading of my work. For Monday, we have on Odin Brihaspati as songsmith, the sung seizing of the wealth of cows. The Nordic textual corpus is a frustrating, glinting thing. So often we glance across a passage therein which evidently speaks to something that is evidently far deeper in meaning than what is written there upon the page, and yet which the ravages of time and obscurity mean that we now cannot feasibly interpret except via informed guesswork. Or can we? Something I have recurrently demonstrated in the course of our work is that even despite Christianization having occurred some decades previously, the Nordic texts of Sturluson do a surprisingly fantastic job of preserving elements that are evidently much more ancient still. How ancient? Well, they run right back to the Proto-Indo-European Urhimat, and afore the divergence of the Vedic and Edic mythologies' respective bearer peoples. What this means, of course, is that when we encounter one of these frustratingly, tantalizingly seeming dead-end passages that is evidently referring to something now irrecoverable, occasionally it turns out not to be so, because it is a direct parallel expression of something also found in the Vedas. Often rather condensed, and occasionally it is clear that Sturluson either did not understand or chose not to convey his understanding of what he was seeking to compile. But it's unmistakable in its resonancy all the same. A grand example of this is to be found in the Ynglinga Saga, wherein the following line otherwise seems almost innocuous in its relative mundanity. Open quotes. Odin knew finally where all missing cattle were concealed under the earth, and understood the songs by which the earth, the hills, the stones, and mounds were opened to him. And he bound those who dwell in them by the power of his word, and went in, and took what he pleased. End quote. And yet, reading that simple line, it was as if thunder had roared with its pleasing familiarity. For I at once recognized this as a more succinct synopsis of something found in well more than half a dozen hymns of the RigVedic, wherein it is the deed of Brihaspati, the lord of prayer, compare the theonym Galdraföðr, and the inspirational or emblematic combat theologian par excellence, who acts as a template for later Vedic priests. I have previously argued in a number of earlier works that Odin and Brihaspati are the same deity, and, for that matter, that Brihaspati and Rudra are likewise one, and so I shall not seek to repeat all of that here. Instead, we shall take just a brief look at these parallel Vedic-Edic expressions of the same archaic Indo-European mythic tradition. Now, there are a number of moving parts to the Vedic presentation of the myth, so it is useful to consider the basic version first, and thence start building in some of the enhancements which build thereupon. At its most succinct, we have the version of the verses presented in Arvi Mandala 1, hymn 62, line 3. Brihaspati cleft the mountain, found the cattle. The heroes shouted with the kine in triumph. Interestingly, this same hymnal also mentions Sarama, the wolf goddess, and her brood, which would presumably be the hounds of Yama, something that is considerably relevant given her own exploits in this area in Rigveda Mandala 10, 108 against the Panis, but more upon that perhaps some other time. A more elaborate presentation occurs in Arvi Mandala 2, hymnal 24. He who with might bowed down the things that should be bowed, and in his fury rent the holds of Sambara, who overthrew that which shook not. Brahmanaspati. He made his way within the mountains stored with their wealth. That was a great deed for the godliest of the gods. The strong things were loosened, and the firmly fixed gave way. He drave the kine forth, and cleft valour through by prayer, dispelled the darkness and displayed the light of heaven. End quotes. Now, this is useful to us because it sets out just how it is that Brihaspati, Brahmanaspati is a slightly more elaborate rendering of the same theonym, how Brihaspati is able to open the mountain, remove the concealment of earth in order to liberate the cattle or the treasure. And it is of course useful to note that wealth and cows are not so dissimilar in the ancient Indo-European conceptual syllabary. Waters and even the sun and the moon, as well as certain womenfolk, are also occasionally found in this role, in other employments of the same formula. So how do you think Brihaspati acquired this wealth? I would say through jihad, but that is a different meme. Through prayer, the spoken, or we should more properly say perhaps the sung, powerful speech, of which he, after all, is the lord and teacher, also the husband, and I do not mean that simply as the potential translated rendering of Pati, but rather to say that Brihaspati's wife is Vach Devi, Vach being the divine speech, who has a conceptual suite of resonances for Freya, the wife of Odin. And as we have explored in amidst other works, such as Furor Teutonicus and Furor Poeticus, the furious goddess given power of both barbarian and Brahmin alike, well, there's quite some resonancy going on there, I'll put it that way. In some tellings, perhaps unsurprisingly, righteous violence is involved, specifically in the form of an orbital bombardment. Brihaspati's prayer conjuring a meteorite, occasionally referred to as a Vajra, understandable given the sonic boom of one entering the atmosphere, the source of meteoric iron, but most especially that this is the congealed force of the Supreme, Brahman, law, in in-universe expression, as we see with the one wielded also by Indra. See for instance my previous work on Athena Stormbringer, and the thunderbolt also of Zeus. Or, first lair claims our eulogy, understanding RigVedic 8:100, Indra Vach. And note that it is Vach that unlocks this weaponry and makes it available for the Sky Father and also for his sons. Yet rather than simply being employed as a brute force landscaping tool to open up the side of a mountain, it is also spoken of as smiting valor, which is a term that must be appropriately understood. For whilst on the one hand, Vala is a demon dragon akin to Vritra, in another sense, Vala simply means a covering, an enclosure, which is not inappropriate for a serpentine demon after all. It may act as a constrictor, entwining itself around its ill-gotten hoard of wealth, in the manner of many a dragon depiction we are familiar with today. However, as is often the case with the Vedic hymnals, it is not quite clear which sense is being meant. The creature bearing the name, or the generalized concept of there being a covering to the wealth that must be rent asunder, so as to allow the entry of the heroic lordly priest, and the consequent egress of the treasures now under his command. Indeed, in some hymnals, what we see is not only the covering of earth, but also of darkness or even cloud that is pierced by the prayer of Brihaspati, and his aforementioned precision, orbital bombardment to be sure. Consider RigVedic Mandala 10, Hymnal 68. As the sun dews with Mith, the seat of Aura, and casts a flaming meteor down from heaven, so from the rock Brihaspati forced the cattle, and cleft the earth's skin as if it were water. Forth from mid-air with light he drank the darkness, as the gale blows a lily from the river, like the wind grasping at the cloud of Vala, Brihaspati gathered to himself the cattle. Brihaspati, when he with fiery lightnings cleft through the weapon of reviling Vala, consumed him, as tongues eat what teeth have compassed. He threw the prisons of the red cows open. That secret name, borne by the lowing cattle within the cave, Brihaspati discovered, and drave, himself, the bright kine from the mountain, like a bird's young after the egg's disclosure. He looked around on rock-imprisoned sweetness, as one who eyes a fish in scanty water. Brihaspati, cleaving through with varied clamour, brought it forth like a bowl from out the timber. He found the light of heaven and fire and morning, With lucid rays he forced apart the darkness. As from a joint, Brihaspati took the marrow of Vala, as he glorified in his cattle. As you can see, the Vedic rishis often delighted in putting quite a lot of poetic effort into saying the same thing repeatedly, which is understandable. It is certainly one way to ensure that the magic of the mythic or referential material is encoded and drawn as if from multiple threads together in parallel weaving for greater empowerment to the resultant invocation. Although this also helps to explicate just why Sturluson's versions of things are so often much more brief than what we find in the Vedas. He is presenting the mythology as narrative rather than, for the most part, there are some plausible exceptions, as something intended to be read as a ritual scripting. And a ritual scripting, as laid down by the Vedic rishis, is rather heavily relevant here, because of course, per the well-known Indo-European principle of mythic recurrence or Aryan eternal return or mythic resonancy, part of how and why we do rites is a staged reenactment of sorts of the original mythic event in question, so as to re-immanentize its benefits, its results, into our community, our localized environment, and the world around us. I have previously argued, as a point of comparative interest, that what's contained in Sturluson's presentation of the myth, the mead of the poetry being obtained, is similarly sourced from a narrative guide or manual for the reenactment of the myth in the ritualized reproduction of the mead by man. RigVedic Mandala 10, Hymnal 67, puts some priests, the students, followers, and sons of Brihaspati, into the frame in just such a manner. Thinking aright, praising eternal order, the sons of Dieos the Asura, those heroes and Gerases, holding the rank of sages, first honoured sacrifices holy statute. Girt by his friends who cried with swan-like voices, bursting the stonier barriers of his prison, the prison I should say, Brihaspati spake in thunder to the cattle and uttered praise and song when he had found them. Apart from one, away from two above him, he drave the kine that stood in bonds of falsehood. Brihaspati, seeking light amidst the darkness, drave forth the bright cows. 3 he made apparent. When he had cleft the lairs in western castle, he cut off 3 from him who held the waters. Brihaspati discovered, while he thundered like Dieos, the dawn, the sun, the cow, the lightning. Or RigVedic Mandala 4, Hymnal 50, line 5. With the loud shouting band who sang his praises with thunder, he destroyed the obstructive Vala. Brihaspati, thundering, drave forth the cattle, the lowing cows who made the oblations ready. As we can see, the sudden occurrence of the priests praying to Brihaspati in this portion of the mythic cycle is simultaneously to connote something within the narrative of the myth, but also to indicate what the priest engaged in this particular prayer to Brihaspati, what these priests are implicitly seeking to do as well. It sets up, if you like, something of an infinite loop, an eternal return you might say if you're another name. In reality, it is all the more powerful for so doing. A perhaps rather different approach to this general concept is also upon display in RigVedic Mandala 10, Hymnal 108, the aforementioned Sarama hymnal, wherein she manages to successfully track down the Panis in a far-flung mountain holdfast beyond the river at the edge of the world, a location perhaps somewhat comparable to the Nordic Outgard or Utgard, and negotiates the Panis to return the ill-gotten spoils that they have stolen from the gods, by threatening to return with the might of Brihaspati and an assemblage of Vedic war priests to carry out a mythically resonant reenactment against these demons as well, unless they relent. Panis. These are the kind which, Sarama, thou seekest, flying, O blessed one, to the ends of heaven, Who will loose these for thee without a battle? Yea, and sharp-pointed are our warlike weapons. Sarama, in reply, even if your wicked bodies, O ye Panis, were arrow-proof, your words are weak for wounding. And were the path to you as yet unmastered, Brihaspati in neither case will spare you. The Panis, in reply, paved with the rock is our treasure chamber, filled full of precious things, of kine and horses. These Panis who are watchful keepers guard it. In vain hast thou approached this lonely station. Sarama, in reply, Rishis will come inspirited with Soma, and Garasis unwearied and Navagvas. This stall of cattle will they part among them. Then will the Panis wish these words unspoken. Panis, in reply, even thus, O Sarama, hast thou come hither, forced by celestial might to make the journey. Turn thee not back, for thou shalt be our sister, O Blessed One. We shall give thee of the cattle. Sarama, in reply, brotherhood, sisterhood, I know not either. The dread Angarasis and Indra know them. They seemed to long for kine when I departed. Hence into distance be ye gone, O Panis. Hence far away, ye Panis. Let the cattle lowing come forth as holy law commandeth. A kine which Brihaspati and Soma, rishis, sages, and pressing stones have found when hidden. End quotes. Now at this point it should be noted that the Ynglinga Saga does not contain details of an assemblage of war priests assisting the Nordic figure of Brihaspati in the recovery of cattle from neath the shrouding of earth within a mountain. Evidently, the summary or the synopsis version of the myth that Sturluson was working from was descended from one of those archaic Indo-European flowerings of the tale that lacked this element, as, to be sure, is the case with various of the Brihaspati Contravala, RigVedic Verses we have aforementioned earlier. However, what we do have is the situation which reasonably closely resonates with the relationship of Brihaspati and Agni, with the Vedic priests in question, that of teacher, instructor, and something of a father figure to them. To quote the Ynglinga Saga again, and from the same section, literally the next line down, as the material around Odin opening up the earth to reveal the cattle and march in and take them. From these arts, i.e. the abilities that enabled the opening of the earth, as well as numerous further empowered potencies, he became very celebrated. His enemies dreaded him. His friends put their trust in him, and relied on his power and on himself. He taught the most of his arts to his priests of the sacrifices, and they came nearest to him in all wisdom and witch knowledge. And from the section immediately prior, he and his temple priests were called songsmiths, for from them came the art of song into the northern countries. Or, phrased another way, in just the same manner that we have Brihaspati presented as the foremost exemplar priest, and acting as the guide, the inceptor instructor, the teacher and father, to the priests of quite specific clades, as seen, for instance, with the occasional references to Agni, also held as a dragon-smiting enclosure smasher. Agni is the first of the Angarasis. Indeed, I would go so far as to suggest that songsmith, as a sort of priestly title, insofar as it is directly stated to be held by Odin's temple priests, is not only an apt rendering for our concept of the Rishi, the C.A.R. of Vedic Verses, in particular, to whom we are attributing in their composition, or compilation through hearing, Shruti, but is also quite an eloquent way to speak of Brihaspati in one of his other roles within the Vedas, namely, that of the Order of the universe, otherwise known as Vishvakarman, wherein through speaking, singing and prayer, and Vishvakarman is held as both Brihaspati and Vajpati, the husband of Vak, he does exactly that. I was unaware of this songsmith rendering in the Ynglinga Saga when I penned and titled my previous work, on Svarog as Skyfather, the Indo-European Skyfather as songsmith of the cosmos, which does make reference to Odin's role in ordering the cosmos, as an instance of that typology. And yet I said it, and have later found my words coming back to me, with a slightly different inflection, the smithing being done to the songs, as well as with the songs, several months later. What was it that we said about Shruti? So whilst we might not have direct presentation of various priests of Odin, directly assisting Odin, in the course of the feat of opening up the earth, cracking wide the mountain in order to liberate the wealth of cattle hoarded therein, we most certainly do have the quite direct statement of Sturluson that he taught the most of his arts to his priests of the sacrifices, and they came nearest to him in all wisdom and witch knowledge, immediately following the regaling of that expression of his power. It would therefore seem eminently logical that in the same way that Brihaspati's original and mythic actions form the template to the later ritual enactments of the human priests, the pre-Christian Nordic and Germanic religion that Sturluson was at pains to preserve, at least in synopsis, and this may also have incorporated such imitative engagements in its ritualine corpus, writes that, for obvious reasons, Sturluson either would not have had direct access to, or would not have chosen to directly represent in the course of his writing, instead reasoning that it would be enough to preserve the narrative that was keyed to same, even though, as we can plainly see, much of the actual detail to the mythic instance in question has been rendered obviated from our understanding of the actual beliefs of the German peoples. We don't know why these cattle were hidden under the earth, nor who put them there, and the closest we get to our suspicions of a dragon being involved is Tolkien's presentation of Gandalf's entering of the Lonely Mountain as part of an effort to liberate its underground hoarded wealth in The Hobbit. I've considered that at some length in some subsequent pieces if you're interested. Perhaps it was enough for the Nordic imagination to know that there was treasure over them in them thar hills, and that treasure implicitly meant an adversary, a fight in one's hands against the current possessors of same. No explicit spelling out of this required, except against truly mighty foes, worthy of the commenting upon. Or perhaps it is that Sturluson, or his sources, did not preserve the same ambiguity of meaning as found in the Vedic material, and rather than regarding the coverer or encircler of the wealth as being both the earth, or darkness, and the monstrous miser of same, only the former sense, that of a physical obstacle, a visual obstruction, and a telluric barrier to entry was maintained. And while it might be tempting to postulate that this dual sense, or for that matter, the demonic sense specifically of Vala, to be some sort of Vedic interpolation or innovation, not found in the original Proto-Indo-European form of the myth, given that both the dual sense, as well as the demonic dragon identification, for Vala's better-known brother Vritra, appears to have been preserved reasonably well by the Norse in the form of Jormungandr, with Vritra's literal meaning of encircler, encloser, restrainer, preserved via Jormungand doing just exactly that in the waters around the world, biting his own tail to form a ring, and the demon dragon understanding for Vritra being preserved with, well, Jormungandr likewise, hence the conflict with Thor, the Indo-European striker or thunderer, akin to Heracles, who fought the Hydra inter alia, and Indra, who fights Vritra, again inter alia. The supposition that this dual sense for the obstacle or adversary thus encountered as a Vedic innovation would seem rather unlikely. Whatever the true explanation for this seeming divergence between the Vedic and Aric traditions upon this matter, we must count ourselves incredibly fortunate, or, with reference to another translation of the same Sanskrit term, blessed, to have the same canon of material available to us to aid in our interpretation and our understanding of the latter. Even if, much like this author, it can occasionally go on at great length, with 3 times as many words as might be held necessary, by a more taciturn Northman, to seemingly repeat the same core point half a dozen or half 100 times. Jai Mahadeva Ki Jai.